Okay, so hello, and welcome to lecture 2 of your Psychology of Wellbeing module, and this is lecture 2 on measurement or measuring well-being. So what you should be able to do by the end of today's sessions, the lectures and personal study, is be able to talk about the measurement of well-being, understand the differences in measures in terms of objective and subjective, in terms of whole life and domain, and in terms of retrospective and real time. All of that will make more sense as you work through, and therefore be able to evaluate different methods used to measure well-being and understand why well-being measurement is useful. So your future lectures are going to refer to studies that talk about well-being and say whether well-being was increased or improved by this or that or the other. So in combination, these first 2 lectures, last week and this week, are going to allow you to critically consider what research has shown in terms of its effect on well-being. You'll be able to look at well-being research and understand how is well-being conceptualized in this study and in this research, and how is it being measured. So let's have a bit of a recap just to get our brains going. So remember, from last week we learned that well-being is multifaceted. In other words, it's not simply one thing, it's complicated. There's lots of different things that comprise well-being, and what those different things are can vary according to how we're defining or conceptualizing well-being. And different people have different views on how it should be defined or conceptualized. Concepts often include feelings. Okay, if you remember, even the concepts that were trying to be less hedonic, so less about feelings and joy, and those that were trying to be more eudaimonic, so more about meaning and self-actualization and the bigger part of life that's not just how you're feeling. Often those eudaimonic concepts still included feelings because they're still part of what well-being is. And concepts often require a cognitive evaluation. In other words, there's always a bit of someone having to think about their life and weigh things up. It might be very broad, like how is your life now, or thinking about your life satisfaction, or it might be that you're being asked to think about something more specific, like meaning or purpose or engagement. And then we had the thing that subjective well-being is one of the most common concepts of well-being. It's the combination of satisfaction with life and positive and negative feelings. But even though it's the most commonly used, it doesn't mean it's the right one. It doesn't mean it's the most complete one. So remember, that's where all those other slightly more eudaimonic concepts came in to try and address that issue. So, ways in which measures of well-being can vary. They can vary in terms of all these things. Okay, they can vary in terms of being subjective or objective, domain or whole life, retrospective or real time, self-report versus other. As we go through this lecture, I'm going to revisit some of the concepts and definitions that I introduced you to last week, but we're going to look at them in terms of how they're measuring well-being, what they ask people to do, to think about it, and I'm also going to introduce you to new measures. So let's begin. Subjective versus objective. So the point of this is that subjective means that it's internal, it's your own thoughts, it's your own assessment of well-being and your own definition of well-being. Okay, objective is from the outside. In other words, it's someone else's assessment of well-being and someone else's definition of well-being. So in terms of assessment, it's about where you are on the scale and how much that is up to you. And in terms of definition, it's what well-being is and how much that is up to you. Let me show you a picture. So in other words, measures of well-being can vary according to how much they are objectively or subjectively defining well-being, in other words, telling you what well-being is, or how much the assessment of well-being is down to you or down to somebody else. This might still be confusing, don't worry. Let's look at some examples to get this more clear. Okay, here's a really extreme example, but it's to help me explain. This is the Human Development Index. Now, what I want you to do is think about last week when we talked about Andrews and Withy and also Bradburn. They all wanted to know about the well-being of a nation, and that sent them off on their investigation looking at individual cognitive assessments and the balance of feelings. But they could have done it like this. This is a kind of alternative version of the well-being of a nation. It's about assessing how a country is developing and how capable it is. Okay, so the United Nations decided objectively that a country's development should be assessed in 3 ways: having a long and healthy life, the people of the country being knowledgeable, and the people of the country having a decent standard of living. And the point is that you can assess these 3 things in objective ways. So having a long and healthy life can simply be looked at by measuring life expectancy and taking those measures. Being knowledgeable can be objectively assessed by looking at how long the people of the country stay in school and stay in education. And having a decent standard of living can be objectively measured by what is your gross national income of this country. So they are 3 objective ways of measuring how a country has developed, how the country is doing. But what about the subjective experience of living in the country? What do the individuals think and feel about living in the country? That's not even on there. So what that means on our little scale is that the Human Development Index is very, very objective in terms of how well-being has been defined. And it's also very, very objective in terms of how it's being assessed. There's no subjectivity in there. All right, that was an extreme example. Let's look at another extreme example. This is the World Health Organization's measure of quality of life. This is massive. They give you 100 questions and it gets at some really precise areas of life. This whole thing has been devised really to assess healthcare. But look at this definition at the bottom. Who defines health as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease? So they are trying to get at well-being here. So given this definition, the World Health Organization can't just measure healthcare objectively in terms of frequency and severity of disease. They need an estimation of well-being. Again, a little bit like Andrews and Withy and Bradburn did in our last lecture. So WHO here, the World Health Organization, have very much decided on what quality of life is, which are these 6 areas in this box: physical health, psychological, independence, social relationships, environment, and spirituality, religion, and beliefs. And these 6 areas cover this list on the left here: physical well-being, mental health, materials, social well-being, employment and education, leisure time, environment, and spirituality. So there's loads of stuff in this, okay? And they are very much, if you look at row 2, psychological, they've really chunked up what they think psychological well-being is. So remember, this is different from RIF's psychological well-being. Okay, this is their own definition, the World Health Organization's definition. So as you can see, they've got negative and positive feelings in there, but they've also got self-esteem, they've got body image, they've got thinking and learning and memory and concentration of all kinds of things. And you can also look at row 3 and row 6 to see how they're being kind of quite objective there in terms of how they're defining what independence is and how they're defining what environment is. So, the whole point about this is that this is really not much about how you feel in terms of your quality of life, but it's about objectively how your life meets the expectations of the World Health Organization. So in terms of our little where things lie objectively and subjectively, who have decided what quality of life is and what the psychological and other aspects of well-being are, and exactly what they included is very, very objective. So there's not much leeway for interpretation or subjectivity. So it's still quite high in terms of objectively being defined by the World Health Organization, and it's also quite objective in terms of how it's being assessed. Okay, so let's have another example of the other extreme. This is Cantrell's ladder. Okay, this is a really simple way to assess kind of overall well-being. It asks someone to imagine their best possible life and their worst possible life, and then put themselves where they think they are between the two. That's it. That's really simple, isn't it? Okay, so where does this fit in our little objective subjective thing? Well, it's really, really subjective, isn't it? In terms of the definition of well-being, no one's telling you what life should be or what a best life should be. It's entirely up to you what's best and what's worse. And no one's telling you what you need to think about when you make that assessment and where you fit. That's entirely up to you. So that's like a really extreme example in terms of the subjective bits of this. Okay, so let's look at a conceptualization of well-being that you know about already from last week. Right, here's the satisfaction with life scale. If you recall, this is part of subjective well-being, and these are the 5 statements you get given if you're being asked to complete this. And you're asked, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? And it gives you these 5 statements. And then it gives you a scale on 1 to 7. And 7 is strongly agree with the statement, and 1 is strongly disagree. And you can pick, and then you get a score. So, where does this fit on the scale? Well, let's just look at these statements. In most ways, my life was close to my ideal. The conditions of my life are excellent. I'm satisfied with my life. So a bit like Cantrell's ladder, it's very, very much up to you what you bring to mind when you answer these questions. Yes, you're being told that this is satisfaction with life, but this allows you to think of absolutely anything to allow you to agree or disagree with these statements. So, really, it's incredibly subjective in terms of your assessment and what you think that well-being is. It's been deliberately designed so that you can bring whatever you want to mind. The definition of what a satisfying life is up to you. And how you assess it is up to you. So it's very subjective in terms of definition and subjective in terms of assessment. Let's look at the other half of subjective well-being. This is the positive and negative affect scale. Okay, so they give you 10 emotions and ask you how much you have felt them during the past week, or it might be the past month or the past year, it depends, but it's always these 10. Okay, and you can see the negative affect words at the top there, and then the next one down is the positive affect, and then they give you a scale. In other words, how often have you felt these on a scale of 1 to 5 that you can see there. And it might look something like this. You might put an X in the box. So, where does this fit? Okay, so what's important here is that the relevant feelings or positive negative effect has already been decided. In other words, this is a list of objectively established words and emotions and feelings. So it's a little bit objective in terms of its definition, because it's telling you what emotions and feelings it wants you to think about. But in terms of you deciding yourself where you are on the scale and how often you felt them, that's entirely up to you. So it's quite subjective in that respect. Okay, let's have a quick think about the strengths and limitations of that particular measure. So, the PANAS has really good psychometric characteristics. What this means is that it has been tried. It has been tried and trialed on many, many different groups of people over time, and also sort of from one time to another longitudinally. People have been compared, and also different groups have been compared. In other words, it's been shown to be really quite valid and accurate in terms of what it's measuring. Is it measuring positive and negative emotions? Yes. Are they robustly being measured? Yes. But is there anything missing? Right, well, let's have a think. These are the positive emotions off that list. I want you to have a look at them. If you want to, you can put me on pause. Are these the only positive emotions that you can feel? Is there anything about these positive emotions that stands out to you? Just put me on pause and have a little think. I'm going to have a drink of water. So, remember that earlier I said that this is effectively an objective list that's been created. Well, the problem with an objective list is that it means that there can be stuff missing that you think should be there, okay, subjectively. So, the authors of this list did realise that there were positive emotions missing, and that the positive emotions on here were very kind of sort of active and well, let me show you. If you look at the top here, the general dimension scales, these are the ones that are almost always used. Okay, these are the ones on the list that I showed you before. But as you can see, they realised that there were other affective states that were not there. If you look down the bottom, there's something called serenity. These are positive emotions that are less active, things like calm, relaxed, at ease. Those words aren't on this list. This list is a very kind of active list. You can also see there's other things up here. Joviality, happy, joyful, delighted, cheerful. They're not there. Self-assurance, proud, strong, confident, bold. So all these lists underneath the general dimension scales, these are all words that they realised were missing. So they basically increased the PANAS. So if you want to, you can use an absolutely massive PANAS, or you can pick different facets of it that you think are more appropriate to what you're trying to look at. So the idea is that as accurate and as valid and as robust as it is, it wasn't perfect. There were still aspects of positive and negative emotions that weren't there. And that was because it was an objective list. Okay, so let's move on and think about another concept that we learned about last week, psychological well-being. So remember that this is Riff's answer to her saying that subjective well-being was too hedonic and didn't address the eudaimonic aspects of well-being, and she felt that there were things missing. So this is just the same slide as last week. This is what the scale might look like. So here what I've done is I've put one example item from each of the 6 facets in here just as an example, and shown you how people would respond. And so you've got to think about, where does psychological well-being fit in terms of objectivity and subjectivity? Let's do another one. Here's PERMA. Okay, so remember, again, this was another conceptualization that was trying to improve upon subjective well-being, but this one, Seligman, definitely made sure that he wanted to keep the positive emotions in there, as well as including things like meaning and purpose and engagement. So I'm just going to show you some example items from this measure. So in terms of positive emotions, they were asking about joy and positive feelings, but look, there's contented, there's quite a calm emotion. So maybe in a way this is an improvement on the PANAS. Engagement questions were all about being absorbed, about being interested, about getting really involved in something that you enjoy doing or like doing. Relationships was about feeling loved, feeling satisfied in your relationships, getting support. Meaning was about a purposeful, meaningful life, about feeling that your life is valuable, about having a sense of direction. And then finally, accomplishment was about progressing towards goals and handling responsibilities. So, again, you can now decide where PERMA fits on our objective-subjective scale. So, now we know about the difference between objective and subjective measures, we can have a little think about issues with subjective measures. So, the whole point about subjective measures is that they very much let you use whatever information you want. Okay, in other words, if you score a 7, you're scoring a 7. You know, if you're scoring high, you're scoring high. It doesn't matter what the source of your 7 is. It's been entirely up to you. And in fact, if you look at satisfaction with life and things like that, it's a bit of a black box what people are using. So you might get a load of people with really high scores, but you don't know how they differ in terms of the information they're using, the types of lives that they lead. So does that matter? Do we need to identify what information people use when they answer this question or these questions? Are some sources of well-being better than others? Are some more worthwhile? Are some more noble? Do some sources of well-being actually sustain us for longer in terms of well-being? Then the other thing is, if it's entirely subjective and it's entirely up to you, how accurate should your judgment be? Does it matter if you don't have a true sense of what's going on in your life? Maybe you think that, you know, your job is going well and you're perfectly happy in your relationships, but maybe you don't know that you're not. Does that matter? Are you being deceived by some people? Does that matter? Do you have all the facts? The other thing is, maybe you are somebody who has adapted to a life that isn't a good life. Maybe your own judgment of your life is not accurate. So the problem with these subjective measures is that they don't account for the fact that maybe we can objectively say what a good life is and what high well-being is. But of course, there's issues with objective measures. One issue with objective measures is that they are quite prescriptive. They're telling people how to live. Think about the psychological well-being facets and PERMA. They are saying these are the things that you should have in your life that define whether it's going well. They're saying that you should have engagement and you should have relationships and you should have purpose. What about people who don't have that and still feel like they're happy and they have high well-being? What about people who feel that they don't need some of those things but they're still fine, thank you? So objective measures tend to prescribe what well-being should be rather than letting someone else decide. And they can be quite value-laden. They're tending to say that some sources of well-being are kind of better than others, are more worthy. That, you know, a life of hedonic happiness from temporary sources is less good and has lower well-being than a life full of meaning and purpose that's been defined by somebody else. So there's a kind of value-laden issue then with objective measures and what they're saying about other aspects of life. So it's quite complicated really, isn't it? What do you want your measure to do? What do you want it to demonstrate in terms of well-being? But there's clearly benefits to subjective and objective measures. So that's the end of part 1. And if you want to have a little break, you might want to have a think about whether you think psychological well-being or PERMA, how they fit in terms of being objective or subjective. And you could put your comments either in the Wellbeing Cafe or under the YouTube videos. Okay. That's it. See you for part 2.